We'd like to get started, so if you could please take your seats. Sorry to break up conversations. I'm Juliana Kerr. I'm the Director of Global Cities and Immigration here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this special briefing on the report, The Economic and Fiscal Consequences of Immigration, that was published by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine last September. I had the privilege of actually observing one of the early meetings of this panel of experts in January 2014 in Washington, D.C., and I've been looking forward to the release ever since. And it was a very rigorous, complex project, so you'll get the full details on that today. The Council is delighted to co-host this with the MacArthur Foundation, and we thank the Foundation and Tara Magner for this opportunity. The Foundation has provided a lot of support to the Chicago Council's research on immigration for the past 5 years, and we're deeply grateful to their partnership. They've also supported this report that you're hearing about. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. Today's briefing is on the record. We are live streaming it, so you'll be able to view it online as well or share the archived video with your friends. It'll be on the Chicago Council's website and I believe on MacArthur's as well. Please silence your phones. But please join the conversation using social media for those of you who engage on Twitter. We have a hashtag, Immigration Impacts, and we have our Wi-Fi and access information on the screen rotating here to my left and right. For those of you who are new to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the Council has provided for nearly a century an independent and nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Please note that the views expressed by the individuals we host are their own and do not represent the institutional positions or the views of the Council. We encourage you to visit the Council's website to learn more about our immigration research and also to learn about upcoming public programs. I do just want to flag one in particular, given our audience here today. We're hosting next Thursday, May 4th at 5:30 p.m. in here, a program on the politics of immigration during the Trump administration. We have Ali Noorani of the National Immigration Forum, who will be here presenting on his new book, There Goes the Neighborhood, How Communities Overcome Prejudice and Meet the Challenge of American Immigration. He'll be in a discussion with Pia Oranius of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, who was also part of the panel of this study, and Dan Stein of the Federation of American Immigration Reform, also known as FAIR. You can go to the Chicago Council's website to register. So now turning to this afternoon's briefing, we're very much looking forward to our presentation. I'm pleased to introduce Tara Magner, the Director of the Chicago Commitment at the MacArthur Foundation. Tara has been a crucial partner to the Council's immigration work. She'll be introducing our speakers and moderating today's discussion, and then we will have time for questions later towards the end of the briefing. Thank you again for being here today.
Thank you and good afternoon. I want to express the MacArthur Foundation's appreciation to the Chicago Council for co-hosting today's event and making it possible for such a large audience to participate. By my count, there are at least 3 other immigration programs underway this afternoon in Chicago. So let me thank each of you for joining us here today. In 2012, the MacArthur Foundation launched a 5-year initiative on immigration with the intent of building the evidentiary base on the economic and fiscal impacts of immigration on our nation. It seemed to us that most debates over the subject were fueled largely by ideology and not by objective data and facts. We believe that rigorous research and unbiased findings could inform the decision of policymakers. We were not altogether certain what the research would show, but believed that it would be better to develop policy from facts and not from mere assumptions. Over those 5 years, the MacArthur Foundation supported the Chicago Council's immigration program, which has studied the effects of immigration in the Midwest and found it to be a significant driver of economic growth across the region. I commend to you the numerous briefing papers on the Council's website, which cover immigration's effects on industries such as healthcare, agriculture, and technology. But stepping back, one of the first things the MacArthur program considered in 2012 was support for an update of a seminal report by the National Academy of Sciences. Some of you may find it familiar. The New Americans, published in 1997, assessed the economic and fiscal impacts of immigration on the U.S. at that time. The report had a long shelf life because it was viewed as rigorous, unbiased, and utterly nonpartisan. These are unique features in the contentious literature over immigration. For these reasons, the New Americans was still cited regularly during debates in Congress on the 2013 Senate Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill. But of course, by that time, the nation had experienced significant shifts in its economy and its demographics, leaving the 1997 report out of date. In 2013, the National Academies convened a new panel and began to produce a new assessment of these questions. So the report presented to you today, equally thick, reflects not just updated data and analysis of the economic impacts of immigration on our nation, but a much deeper and broader analysis of the fiscal impacts. Specifically, it contains analysis of the fiscal impacts for each of the 50 states. We hope that this product will inform policymakers, civic leaders, business people, and all those interested in the effects of immigration. The MacArthur Foundation is grateful to the National Academy, and especially to the panel it convened for this project, the Academy's expert staff and consultants, for the innumerable number of hours they dedicated to producing this report. We're very fortunate to hear today from the chair of the panel and one of its members. Please allow me to introduce Francine Blau, the Francis Perkins Professor of Industrial and Labor Relations and Professor of Economics at Cornell University, and Kim Rubin, Senior Fellow at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center at the Urban Institute. First, Fran, and then Kim will describe the report and its findings, and then we'll welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm really delighted to be here today and to have the opportunity to talk about the report with this group in particular, who I know has a great interest in the topic. It was an honor to be able to chair this panel of leading experts in the field, drawn from a number of disciplines, including economics, demography, and sociology, various points of view. So it was a very diverse panel with deep expertise. And we were assisted by consultants and staff to the panel, and also staff at the Academy itself. And we are deeply grateful to the MacArthur Foundation for supporting this 2.5 years of intensive and very hard work looking into this topic, exploring the literature on it, and doing original research on the fiscal effects. And we are very lucky to have Kim Rubin with us today as a panel member. She oversaw and directed our analysis of the fiscal impact at the state level. So let me start with an overview. I'm going to talk today, Kim and I will be talking today about 3 major aspects that the report focused on. First, we asked, how have immigration patterns changed recently? And recently for us was this 20-year period since our predecessor report had been published. And I guess I was surprised myself, even as something of an expert in the area, at some of the changes that had occurred in these patterns. Then a major focus was, how does immigration affect the U.S. economy? Personally, I'm a labor economist, and that's one of the first things I look at and think about, the impact on the labor market. But actually, immigration has broader and other impacts that the panel also investigated. We also considered the second major topic, how does immigration affect public revenue and spending, or the fiscal balance? And we did this at 2 levels. First, at the overall national level, so we considered both federal and state budgets, but the budgets were aggregated up to the national level. And then, how does immigration affect the fiscal picture in the states? Just before we delve into it, let me briefly summarize the findings of our voluminous, Tara showed you how voluminous the work was. In terms of recent changes in immigrant patterns, a number of things stood out. First, there has been, in the past 20 years, a substantial growth in the unauthorized population, but that growth peaked out in 2008 and has stopped since then. So actually there has been no further increase in the number of the unauthorized population since 2008. Moreover, as the U.S. labor force growth has slowed with the aging of the population, immigrants and their children will account for the vast majority of current and future labor force growth. It's also true that the immigrants themselves have changed, and they are getting increasingly more educated. In terms of economic effects, there are many important benefits to the nation of immigration, including beneficial effects on economic growth, innovation, and entrepreneurship, with, we found, little to no negative effect on the overall wages or employment of native-born workers in the longer term. To the extent there are any negative wage impacts, they're most likely on native-born high school dropouts and prior immigrants. That's the groups most likely to be affected, and I'll return to that point. In terms of fiscal effects, they were more complicated than the economic effects. The fiscal picture does suggest negative short-run effects, especially at the state level. In the longer term, taking a 75-year time horizon, the fiscal impact of immigrants is positive, although there are still, at the federal level, although there are still negative effects at the state level due to the cost of educating the children of immigrants. And that is something I know Kim is going to want to come back to. Since the children of immigrants, or what we call the second generation, actually go on to become the most positive fiscal contributors in the population. So let's take a quick look at immigration patterns. Over the past 20 years, the share of the population comprised of immigrants has increased from 9% to 13%. My forebears came in the last great wave of immigration around the turn of the 20th century, and the shares of the population today are beginning to approximate the share in that earlier wave. One thing I found very interesting is if you include the U.S.-born children of immigrants, you find that nearly a quarter of the U.S. population today is either an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. There have been these trends as well in the unauthorized population, which I mentioned. Over the past 20 years, that population has nearly doubled, but again, it peaked around 2007, and has since leveled off. So it stopped growing. Now you hear about detentions at the border. What that means, if the unauthorized population has stopped growing, yes, there are still some people coming in, but their numbers are balanced by the people who are leaving. Another important change is immigration. The education of immigrants has increased. Immigrants have traditionally here been less well educated than the native-born. That is still the case, but among recent immigrants, especially the younger ones, have very much narrowed the education gap with the natives. And this diagram, I think, summarizes it very well. If we just focus on 2 years, 1970 at the left of the chart and 2012 at the right of the chart, you see that in 1970, a little over half of all immigrants had less than a high school education. But by 2012, that was the case for about a quarter. Where has the growth in education been? It's actually been at the college and beyond level, where you can see in 1970, 8% of immigrants coming in, recent immigrants, were college grads, and 12% had education beyond that. Now it's 22% college grads and 16% with education beyond that. What this boils down to, if we look at the immigration population as a whole, is that immigrants are overrepresented at both extremes of the education distribution. On the one hand, a disproportionately large number of high school dropouts, but at the other end, they have a disproportionately large number of those with more than college, particularly in technical areas. It's also true, a recent development is that immigration has become more dispersed across the nation, geographically dispersed. Immigrants were historically concentrated in a few states and cities. They have really spread out, and you can see that in this chart. If you look at the left, that's the top tier of states with the highest share of newcomers, and you can see their share has gone down, and it's more dispersed among states that had traditionally lower shares. Now, what does this mean for, these trends mean for the Midwest? The Midwest, in many ways, is hand in hand with the national statistics. The immigrant population has increased considerably since 1970, from 1.9 million to 4.5 million, as has the share of the population, from 3% to 7%. However, immigration has actually grown faster in other areas. So as a result, the share of all immigrants who reside in the Midwest has actually decreased a bit over this period, from almost 20% to 11%. What about Illinois itself, where we are now? The pattern is similar, except that Illinois has been and does continue to be a top immigrant destination, and it too has seen an increase in immigrant population from 0.6 million to 1.8 million, and in the share of foreign-born from 6% to 14%, but Illinois too has seen its share of the total immigrant population in the U.S. fall a bit, from 6.5% to 4.4%. So how would we expect this to affect, first, the labor market? So I'm coming at this from an economics perspective, as many of our panelists were. What does economic theory predict? Okay, economic theory predicts that if there are negative labor market effects, they would be most likely visited on native-born workers who are most similar to the immigrants themselves. And the way to think about this is, if we have an influx, say, of low-skilled immigrants, then the supply of this group will grow relatively, and that could bid down the wages of the group. Okay? That might be the case, for example, among construction workers, if we have an influx of construction workers. Interestingly, however, economic theory says if a skill group is complementary with immigrants, that is, they don't do the same thing, in fact, they work with the immigrants to perform a task. An example of that might be a construction supervisor. They may see the demand for their labor go up as the pool of construction workers expands, and they might see their wages rise. So it's interesting that even within the labor market, there could be some diverse effects. Moreover, this is just theory, and we have to see empirically how important it is. And our major effort was to look at the empirical results. And what we found there is, as I noted at the outset, when measured over a longer period of time, 10 years, the impact of immigration on the wages of the native-born overall was small to negligible. Okay, so there seemed to be no impact on the wages of natives overall. The estimates for subgroups spanned a wider range, and in particular, if we focus on native-born, less skilled workers, that is high school dropouts, we found ranges of estimates from no effect to a negative effect. So the way we summarized it was that the group of natives who was most substitutable for low-skilled workers may have experienced a negative wage effect. The evidence was actually a bit stronger that prior immigrants experienced some negative wage effects of the influx of new immigrants. There was really even less evidence of an impact of immigration on employment. None was found for native workers overall. One study found that immigrants may reduce hours worked, but not employment of native teenagers. Now, why would that be? Well, those are two groups, teens and recent unskilled immigrants, that may compete in the labor market for similar kinds of jobs. But it was again the case that there was some indication that there may be negative impact on the employment of prior immigrants of a recent influx. Now, most of the research has focused on the impact of immigration overall, or in particular on the impact of immigration of less skilled workers. But I showed you that one of the interesting recent developments has been the growth of high-skilled immigration. So there have been a few recent studies that looked at the impact of high-skilled immigrants on employment and wages. And interestingly, there is a number of studies have found a positive impact of skilled immigration on the wages and employment of both college-educated workers and non-college-educated workers. Now, why would this be? Because I already enunciated a theory that suggests, at least for the ones that they could potentially compete with, maybe there would be a negative effect. There's a number of possible reasons. We all think that they are reasonable. First of all, high-skilled immigrants might be complementary with native-born workers. Consider the case of college-educated. Maybe the native college-educated have a comparative advantage in areas that require extremely good English speaking and writing skills. Immigrants could have an advantage in technical areas. They could work together and boost each other's productivity. One thing that has been documented, and I'll return to in a minute, is that high-skilled immigrants increase innovation and productivity. What this means is they can enlarge the pie, giving higher wages to everybody, themselves and native workers as well. And then finally, there's some indication that high-skilled immigrants, in interacting with native-born workers, what we call their skills may spill over. You know, you learn things from your coworkers, and it might increase the productivity of native workers who are employed with them. I should mention here that some studies that focused on narrowly defined fields, and there have just been a couple of such studies, have found adverse effects on wages or productivity of natives working in those particular fields. And the two fields that we came across, one was mathematicians, with the influx of mathematicians from the former Soviet Union after the Cold War ended, and the other is possibly for programmers. Okay, so moving on from the labor market effects that I found kind of interesting and varied, immigration has other impacts on the economy more broadly. And one is on economic growth, and this sounds very much in line with the research you've heard about the impact on the Midwest from this group. Immigration does seem to have a positive effect on economic growth, and let me reiterate what that means. A positive effect on economic growth means that the pie is getting larger and there's potentially more for everybody. So we don't have to necessarily all be fighting so hard on how large our piece is. Research suggests skilled immigrants boost our capacity for innovation and technological change, and it's been documented that they raise patenting per capita that contributes directly to productivity growth. Moreover, immigrants tend to contribute to entrepreneurship, so they don't just look for jobs, they also start businesses and potentially employ others. Then I do want to return to the point I made at the outset that's very important. We have an aging population, and I personally am contributing to that. I'm a baby boomer, and much as we baby boomers dislike to think so, we are actually getting older. And as we get older, we're leaving the labor force, we're retiring. So that slows the growth of the labor force, our aging population. Our birth rates are relatively low. So from both ends, we would not have much labor force growth without the infusion of immigrants, which is particularly beneficial because the optimal time to immigrate is in the prime working years. That's because it's costly to immigrate, and you would want to do it when you're relatively young and you have a number of years over which to reap the benefits. So actually, demographers have found that immigrants and their children, that is, includes the second generation, those born here of immigrant parents, account for the vast majority of current and future labor force growth. There are also some other some other economic effects of immigration. One is that immigrants increase the availability and affordability of some types of consumer goods, and that benefits the consumers who do use them. Prime example is childcare and house cleaning services that increase the ability of women to work outside the home, food preparation, household repair and construction. These are all areas where immigrants have made the difference in availability and affordability. Another interesting area is the demand for housing. It's emblazoned on many of our minds that the famous Great Recession was in part caused by the crash of the housing market. So we know how important the value of housing assets are to people. As the population ages, there's less demand for housing. But immigrants and the second generation are a source of demand that helps to buoy up housing markets. And then finally, immigrants are a mobile population. They're mobile when they first come here, and also they tend to move around from place to place here more than natives do because they're less rooted. And this helps to make labor markets more efficient because immigrants can move where the jobs are, and if the jobs aren't, they can leave those markets. So one way it's been put is that immigrants may help to grease the wheels of the labor market and help it work more efficiently. So now I'd like to turn to the fiscal impacts, and my colleague Kib Rubin is going to present.
It's always hard getting the clicker away from her. Thank you, and thank you for coming and hearing us talk about the work we did on this. Funny story before I start. When MacArthur was thinking about whether or not it was worthwhile to redo this 1997 study, I was one of the people they asked about whether this would be valuable or not. And I kept telling them yes, how important it was for us to get new information about this. I was asked this 3 times, kept saying yes, kept saying, but it's really important to look across the different states. States are really different and immigrants are going different places. Next thing I know, this was funded and they asked me if I would be on this panel. And I thought, oh, now I have to put my money where my mouth is. And basically actually figure out how we look at these things across the different states to try and figure out what it means to different places as we have more immigrants in different places. So as Fran covered, we generally found that immigration has been pretty good for the US economy. It basically has increased the size of the economy, increased growth, and has allowed some specialization in economic activity. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and think about what it means for the fiscal impact of the country. And so what we did is we basically looked at the effect of immigrants, and we also looked at the effects of everyone. And we measure this as how much they contribute to revenue, so how much they pay in taxes, and how much they receive in services and spending. What we're doing is a cost-benefit analysis. And what we're doing is a little different than some other studies in that we're looking at all of the money that's raised in the country and all of the spending that's done and allocating it to people. So we're not just looking at programs that are specifically about immigration. So it's not that we're just looking at things like programs for refugee resettlement or English as a second language. We're looking at the whole pie, and we're distributing it across everybody who's living in the country right now. So that means that all of that needs to be allocated across people. So there are a couple of issues you have to consider when you start an exercise like this. The first is there were costs, and I said that we, allocate them across everybody, but what do you do with certain things? What do you do with things like defense that we don't actually think increases as you have another person here? So if you have things like defense or debt and the deficits that happen before people even come to the country, are we going to allocate that across everybody on an average basis? Or are we going to actually say that if you're new and the costs aren't going to go up, we're not necessarily going to allocate that to you? And so what we do, largely because there were a lot of economists on this study, is we did it both ways. So part of the reason the report is the size that it is that often when we came up with these questions about how are we going to do things, instead of actually answering the question, our answer was yes. And so, as we go through things, you'll see that we have like 9 different versions of ways of asking these questions and answering these questions. And so what I'm going to summarize right now are sort of across these different ways of doing this. But just know that that's how we kind of struggled with these questions. One of the other things that was really important is how do you assign education costs? What you'll see later is that a lot of our results and whether or not immigrants are expensive or not come down to who do we say benefits from the cost of education? And so do we say that as a society we all are better off if we invest in education because the kids that are in school right now are going to be the labor force of tomorrow? Or do we say that the people who are primarily benefiting from it are the kids themselves and give them those costs? Or do we say that those kids wouldn't be here if their parents didn't have them and allocate those costs to the parents? In much of what we do, we assign those costs to their parents. And so part of the reason that we end up finding higher costs for immigrants has to do with the fact that they have more children than native-born people. And so a lot of what we're saying and a lot of when we say that the costs are higher is largely due to the fact that those education costs are assigned to them. Okay, so what this picture does is this shows you 3 different generations. So first I sort of want to define what we mean by generation. So first generation are immigrants. These are people who are new to this country. They've come, they were born somewhere else. Second generation, so that blue line, which is sort of on the top, those are the children of immigrants. And so those are people who are native born, so they're US citizens, but their parents came from somewhere else. And then that third line, that green line, is the third or more. So these are people whose grandparents were immigrants, but it could also be people whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower. So those are native-born people whose parents were not necessarily immigrants. And so what this picture is showing you is a little bit about the fiscal impacts of being a person in the United States, or really being a person anywhere. So if you look, this is the age of people and whether they cost us money or whether they're contributing. And unsurprisingly, before you actually go to work, you cost us money, right? The fact that we have a public education system means that it costs money to have children, as any of you who are parents know, and we have to pay for them to get educated. Then that middle group, from what we're saying is about 22 or 23, people start contributing more in taxes paid than they're getting in services, and that relationship where people are paying more into the system than they're getting out of the system largely continues until they retire. Once you retire, you're paying less in income taxes, and you're largely getting a lot of benefits. You're getting Social Security, you're getting Medicare, and so the cost shifts again. And so when we're talking about who's costing the government money and who's paying into the system, mostly it has to do with this age distribution. And so the fact that immigrants come and they're largely of working age means that they're net contributors in those early years. If you're less educated, you're earning less, so you're paying less in taxes, largely at the federal level, because we have a progressive income tax system. And then for people who have more children or dependents, because what we do is we assign those costs to their parents rather than to themselves, we're taking all of those costs that are below age of 20 in our picture, and we're moving them to their parents. So if you have more kids, you cost more money even though you're paying taxes, and it's largely going for education costs. So what do we find? And some of this I just said. So immigrants tend to have lower fiscal contributions than the native-born, especially at the state level, and this is largely due to education. Right? So in part, they're contributing less in lower taxes if they have lower wages, but most of this is coming from the fact that they have more kids because they are of childbearing age more than the native population. And so they have a larger number of children, which raises government expenditures. But this, again, doesn't take into account the fact that we are all going to benefit from the fact that those kids, once they start contributing, end up paying more in taxes. So if I go back to this picture, you'll notice something we found is that for different ages, that second generation, so those children of immigrants, tend to be the ones that are actually contributing the most. And so part of what we're doing when we're investing in kids is we're getting payoffs later in terms of them earning more when they go to work. So another thing we found, which is different than that 1997 study, is we find all three groups, immigrants, second generation, and third and more generations, had fiscal shortfalls. This has to do with the fact that we are running deficits, right? So at the time that we did this study in 2013, we were running a federal deficit of about $1 trillion. And so if we add up all of the money that's being spent on services and all the money that's being paid in taxes, we have a gap. And so that means immigrants are more expensive than the money they're paying in taxes, but so is everybody else. And it's because we're running shortfalls at the federal level, which means that we're eventually going to have to pay that off. And so in part, having more immigrants and expanding the size of the population will make it easier in the future to pay off those deficits. But it's also important to note that much of our results, especially we've done some 75-year projections, depend critically on what we assume we're doing at the federal level in terms of those deficits. So at some point, if you look at those numbers, we have to stop spending more than we're bringing in taxes. And when we make that change, will affect how beneficial immigrants are or are not to the country. In general, we find over the long term, immigrants actually are quite beneficial, especially to the federal government, while they still cost state and local governments money. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did at the state and local level. And so consistent with the national level analysis, we find that first generation adults plus their kids are more costly to state and local governments than second and third generation. But it depends a lot on whether we're using average costs or marginal costs. So if we're using the costs that include all of the spending or just the things that we think vary as you increase the number of people here. Again, that second generation group contributes more to the bottom line of state and local governments in general compared to the first and the third plus generation. But this also varies a lot across states. And this is largely coming from demographic differences. So it depends on how different immigrants look from the native born within a state. Do they have more kids? Do they not have more kids? and also by the policy choices made within states. In states that actually have less progressive tax systems, so if they actually raise more of their money using sales taxes rather than income taxes, so if you're a state like Illinois that has a relatively flat income tax and rely more on your sales tax, immigrants are gonna look better than a state like New York or California that has a highly progressive income tax, where you actually have higher income people paying more in. The other thing that affects this a lot in terms of policy choices is how much you're gonna spend on education and schooling. So what does this look like? So this is the difference in fiscal burden. So this is the difference between average spending for the first generation and the third or more generation. On the picture, the map on the left, I think it's your left still. The ones that are labeled average cost allocation is assigning all costs to everybody. The ones that are assigned on a marginal cost allocation are only assigning those costs that we think vary as you have more people there. And unsurprisingly, we find that immigrants in general, that first generation, are more expensive than the third generation, but it varies a lot whether we're doing this on this average cost allocation or the marginal cost allocation. If you go through the book and you look at chapter 9, you'll find that our maps are arranged in sort of this odd way where it doesn't make any sense if you're used to looking at state data. And the way they're organized are California's at the top because it has the highest share of its population that is immigrants, and West Virginia is on the bottom because it has the lowest share of its population that are immigrants. And that's because once you get to those bottom 10 or 15 states, our numbers aren't necessarily very well estimated. And so partly we organized our data in this way because we're much more confident of what we're saying about states that have more immigrant populations than the ones on the bottom. And so that's just something, if you look at the numbers, some of the numbers need to be taken with a grain of salt just because we don't have as large sample sizes once we actually start doing this on a state-by-state basis. So this is basically the differences between costs on the average and marginal basis. This is the differences in the number of kids across the generations. And so basically, first generation overall in the US, immigrants have a higher share of children than third or more generations. So this is just sort of highlighting in a visual way the fact that immigrants are much more likely to have children, especially school-age children. So what does this mean in the Midwest? To sort of bring it home. So what we find if we look at those net differences is for the Midwest as a whole, the average net cost is minus $3,200, but on the margin it's minus $1,300. This varies a lot across places. A place like Minnesota that has actually seen a pretty large increase in recent populations, especially refugee populations, actually has higher costs. And if you look at the second side of the chart of the table, that's largely coming from the fact that they have a much higher share of children assigned to each person. So it's the fact that they have 0.64 compared to 0.35 for third or more generation. So more of the population and more of the population of children are coming from that immigrant population. And so that's largely what's driving our costs, and it varies across places. You'll notice that Indiana, I'm not quite sure why its differences are so much smaller, but I think it has to do with the policies in place. But when we get to those marginal costs, immigrants are actually less costly than natives. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is those are overall immigrant populations. Something else that I thought was interesting looking at the data, and this gets back to what Fran was talking about before. If we look at recently arrived immigrants, we actually find that the share in the Midwest is much larger. So they make up 19% of the first generation in the Midwest. So more of them are new, which means that more of them in the Midwest actually are those people who have more education. And so this just sort of gives you some information about how they look compared to the rest of the country and for others. And I'll stop there. I have a conclusion slide. We may as well cover it. This is just reiterating what Fran said before. On the economic effects, we generally found that immigration has been beneficial for the country. Things are more mixed on the fiscal side. This is largely due to how we're allocating the cost to education. But it's important to keep in mind that we're not recommending that we don't want to invest in educating kids, because it's really important to note that those kids are going to be the labor force going forward. And we actually want them to have the skills needed to thrive in the 21st century as we go forward. And I'll stop.
Well, I took this down and I left my glasses up here, so I really.
But if anybody doesn't need to see the slides, it's you.
Well, thank you very much. Fran, I want to just go back very quickly to talk about how the National Academies selects panels, because as we mentioned, I believe at least the shelf life of these reports is in part because they are viewed as neutral and rigorous. So can you describe how that process works and how the National Academies comes to form a panel?
Yes, I think that's a really good question, and it's a very long vetting procedure when they go into a new area. And I personally was not involved in selecting this panel, but when they go into a new area, they collect the names of the experts in that area. In this particular case, we wanted to include people who covered the disciplines that we were going to use in our analysis. Now, even leaving politics aside, there are some disagreements among academicians, and the Academy, as I understand it, actually goes out of its way to include people with varying points of view. Then I might mention, too, that when we completed our 2.5 years of work and we had a document, it was rigorously reviewed by, I think, about 13 people, and we got comments from all of them and revised for all of them.
And so, Kim, I'll direct to you. Despite the rigor and the comprehensive nature of this report, some elected officials have nonetheless pulled out a single line or a single fact out of context to make political points. So how would you, for example, respond to President Trump's assertion that immigration costs taxpayers billions per year?
And I think this gets back to, and I heard that when he made that comment, to the fact that everybody costs billions of dollars per year because we're running deficits. And so the answer is yes, but the solution to that isn't necessarily to ban immigration, it's actually to raise taxes or cut spending. And so I largely do tax policy, and I came into this from a fiscal window into immigration. And so in my office, we've been spending a lot of time waiting for that tax plan to fall yesterday. And that one page, in all of its detail, I can tell you, is not necessarily going to make the costs of government any less expensive, because, you know, if we're cutting taxes and we're not cutting spending, everybody is going to cost more money because of, you know, when you have a balance sheet, if you have less money coming in and more spending going out, things cost money.
And let me just piggyback in terms of your first question. One reason our report is susceptible to this is it is an objective document that gives varying ranges of estimates and states varying sides of issues. And I thought Kim said it very well. We said, should we do this or that? And we said yes. You know, so we didn't say, let's just do the marginal cost approach. And we said we're preparing the report and we want to provide as much information as possible. So that does make us susceptible to this kind of thing.
All right, so forgive the prelude to this question, but you've pointed out the short-term fiscal costs to the states and the long-term benefits to the federal government. But Fran, you also mentioned that immigrants tend to move around more, responding to opportunities. So recognizing this report doesn't make policy recommendations, what might states or the federal government think about as they face that conundrum where the state of Illinois may be educating young people and then obviously cannot stop them from leaving the state if they choose to pursue a career elsewhere?
And so if I start, we could have more federal contributions to education. You would think if they are benefiting, and they are benefiting, in part because people are mobile, but also because the way that we tax at the federal level versus the state and local level is much more progressive. So the investment in that return to education increases wages, and the income tax, which is largely what the federal government gets its money from, is progressive, and it raises more money. So you could imagine that the federal government could pay a higher share. And we would possibly say that the costs and benefits would reflect increasing the federal role in education. The downside to that, and if you were in a room full of state governors, I think they would love to have more money coming in from the federal government, but they would be a little nervous about what that would mean in terms of control. Now, one place where we actually do this fairly well at the federal level, this isn't about immigration, this is just about education. If we think about higher education and the fact that the federal government largely supports redistribution in terms of things like Pell Grants, that's a place where the federal government is actually recognizing the benefits of increasing the education of people who live here, even those that can't afford it, and is actually has an explicit policy. So you could imagine a recognition of the fact that the federal government is better at redistribution, and if there are these things that have spillovers, they should increase the amount of money that they pay in.
Would you like to add to that at all,
I
Fran?
think that, I agree very much with that, yeah.
Now, Fran, you talked about some of the negative wage effects on the native-born population, and of course, this is another argument that's often made in the political discourse. How important do you think immigration is to those wage effects?
Right, I think that, and the election campaign did not help this. There was a tendency to, all right, there are groups in our population that have not been doing that well in recent decades, and economists have studied it and acknowledged it. The least educated, those who haven't completed high school, but also high school graduates, are not doing that well compared to college graduates. But the question is, why? And I think that there's a huge amount of research not explicitly examined by our report, but a huge amount of research that suggests that it's technological change that is primarily responsible for these trends, not immigration. And so I think this was almost, I hate to use the word, but it was scapegoating.
And I'm just going to add to that, but I'm going to start by saying that much of the opinions of things that Fran and I say right now reflect our opinions once we get beyond the report, not that of the National Academies. And I am saying that because I am about to dive in. It is, from my perspective, it is unfortunate that there's been, I think there has been scapegoating, and I think largely we've seen a lot of rhetoric happening right now, and I live in Washington. So it might affect me more than you out here. In terms of almost answering the wrong question, right? I agree with Fran that a lot of what we're seeing is technological change, and yet a lot of what we heard in the election and what we're hearing right now is trying to restore the greatness of what we look like in 1950s or 1960s. Whereas it seems like we should be maybe thinking about how do we invest in people so that they're doing the jobs of tomorrow rather than the jobs of yesterday. And so this is my own opinion, but I feel like it's scapegoating a group, but it's not necessarily going to solve the problems that we have. Whereas if we actually shifted our focus to try and help people thrive going forward, it would be a better solution.
Which goes to our perhaps naive notion that facts and evidence still matter in policy debates, and policymakers could take up this report and make some fine decisions with it. I think we'll turn to the audience in just a moment, but why don't I just ask each of you, what surprised you most, or both in terms of the research you conducted and the findings of this study?
Well, I guess from my perspective, I was aware of some of the research on skilled immigration, but I was not aware fully of the large contribution that that group is making. And also, another thing that just surprised me personally was the trends in unauthorized immigrants, immigration. So I knew that what I thought was in response to the recession, the inflow of unauthorized had declined. But this is apparently a more stable, longer-term trend that relates to, in part, demographic and economic conditions in Mexico that have changed with rising education and falling birth rates there and improvements in the Mexican economy. So it's very likely that this large influx that we had of unauthorized immigrants has really plateaued.
And I was surprised by that. And the other thing that was surprising to me, I knew that the demographic changes were happening, and I knew that the native-born were aging. But this fact that largely all of our increase in our labor force going forward is going to be immigrants and their children, starting really quickly in like 2020 or so, was surprising to me.
And maybe you were surprised that advocating for a new report would result in being asked to serve.
Well,
In hindsight, she shouldn't have been, but
yes. I was like, I don't study immigrants, but you will.
Thank you for your service.
We appreciate it too.
And it's important, right? And, you know, and this is, again, personally, I think it's really important to understand where we're going as a country. And I think we are a country of immigrants, and we have been. And so recognizing and putting facts on the table about what is, you know, what the costs and benefits are and where we seem to be going seems really important, especially in the current time when it seems like there's more rhetoric than information.
All right, thank you. There are Chicago Council staff members with microphones. Please raise your hand and wait for a microphone so that people watching the live stream can hear. So how about the hand right next to you by the door?
During the last election, there was an obvious difference between urban and rural population in terms of the voting outcomes. Did this study at all get into differences between urban and rural counties or regions in the United States? And different immigration patterns?
We didn't, but there was actually a sister study that was done that looked more at integration in general, that actually spent more of its time. We had briefings on sort of what it meant for rural versus urban populations, but I don't think we covered that very much. Whereas I think this sister study that came out the year before that Mary Waters was the chair of, I think looked at those questions in more detail.
Right, and that study, like this one, can be found on the National Academy's website.
One interesting point, and this is speaking, we had a reference to just a few studies and didn't look into it deeply, but even press reports are suggesting that immigrants have actually helped to bail out, I don't know about rural areas, but small towns and smaller cities are actually benefiting from an influx of immigration that brings more consumers, that helps the local economy, that provides maybe a critical mass of workers that might bring in more businesses. So it can have, actually, they can have a positive effect in rural areas or smaller towns.
And there's some of that, especially in housing, if you think if people are looking for people to buy houses or changes in transitions.
And they're looking for lower cost houses,
Right.
so it's
All right, Rebecca in the front? Hold on, can you wait for the mic, please? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the study, and thank you, Tara, for supporting this. So my question is, I'm wondering if on the fiscal costs, both the marginal and the allocation, did you tease out undocumented immigrants? Because they oftentimes do not of the taxes they contribute, they don't get the federal benefits such as healthcare, MAP grants, Pell grants, and did that change sort of like after retirement, right? They don't get
Right.
Social Security and things like that, so.
And we did not. And one of the set of studies or set of recommendations that we do make in our report is the call for better data. So part of the reason we didn't tease out undocumented immigrants is the fact that we don't have very good measures. So we did some stuff on the aggregate, but we didn't have enough confidence in being able to say in our microdata, so the data on individuals that we used for these allocations on the fiscal side, who was undocumented and who was not.
But our totals, because we couldn't break it down, but our totals include
They
both.
include them.
Yeah, do include them.
All right, in the green plaid shirt on the aisle.
Hi, thanks so much for your report. Let's say lawmakers came to you and they asked you for some suggestions on immigration reform. What kind of legal channels would you create to maximize economic value in the United States? I mean, just some like ballpark bullet points, more immigrants, less immigrants, kind of what suggestions would you give? God forbid we're talking about immigration reform right now at the federal level, but just in case in a few years that became something of importance.
And worth noting, these would be in your personal capacity, correct?
So,
Yes, this is not, our report actually made the decision not to provide any recommendations apart from a few about data collection.
I think, you know, if I was going to make recommendations, I would say that we might want to rethink how we do immigration in terms of how people come in. But in general, I don't think, I would want information to be fact-based and looked at where we want to go as an economy. In general, all immigrants, so it's not just the immigrants with the highest level of education that I think are actually contributing to our country. If we think about the immigrants and the workers who are coming in and making it possible for other people to do the jobs that they do, that goes across the skill distribution. So I think in general, recognizing that it is beneficial to have immigrants and have more of a population would be useful. If there was interest in sort of thinking about whether we wanted to sort of specialize and change some of the rules in place, I think that that could be beneficial to do, but I would want that to be based on facts and information rather than fear-mongering and misinformation.
An interesting point that came up in our research, and we mentioned it. We didn't feel all the evidence was there, but interestingly, a very well-known sociologist, Doug Massey, who does very good work, has argued that increasing immigration restrictions actually contributed to the growth in unauthorized immigrants within the United States. Because when immigrants could come and go more easily, they did come and go. Mexico is very close by. But when we erected more and more barriers, if you got through the barrier, you certainly didn't want to go back because you didn't know if you could come again. And then you also wanted to bring your family. You didn't want to live your whole life without your family. So that's a really interesting insight. I mean, about, well, somebody I heard wanted to build a wall, I think, or something. But actually, I think that the wall thing is really just misdirection because our borders are already heavily patrolled.
All right, Josh Hoyt in the back there by the door.
Hi, thank you very much. I work with the National Partnership for New Americans, and so the previous study was presented at the National Immigrant Integration Conference. People really liked it. So when you look at both the costs and the benefits, immigration is spread out unevenly across the states. So intuitively, we would think that the states that have the most experience with immigration, like New York, California, Illinois, is better at integrating people, and therefore the contributions are greater. I know that you didn't make policy recommendations, but is there any conclusions you can draw about what we know works and what that might mean for the newer port of entry states where the backlash is greatest. That was one question. The second one is you didn't really talk about teasing out the impact based on race, specifically on African Americans of immigration. I'm curious about that too.
Do you mean native-born African Americans?
Yes.
Well, in terms of your second question, we did find some studies that suggested the negative effects might be worse for African Americans, but they were old studies that were summarized in the previous report, and we couldn't find evidence one way or another more recently, so we did not include that in our major findings. I mean, of course, African Americans are have a larger share of less educated, so to the extent the less educated are hurt more, they would be included in that. In terms of your first question, we did not look into specific programs in the states that have been successful or not successful in absorbing immigrants. I mean, I think that's a great question. It's just not something we examine.
Maybe there on the aisle? Thank you.
Thank you. Other countries have different immigration policies. Canada comes to mind, fewer undocumented immigrants, and also a priority given to higher education and immigrants with greater wealth. Did you make any attempt to compare the fiscal and economic impact of those countries, of their policies, or do you know of any studies that have done so?
There are studies that have done so. Off the top of my head, you know, I can't point you to them. We certainly talked about that. It's a very interesting idea because, again, it's like what sometimes we call in economics a natural experiment. So some countries have different policies. Are the impacts different? And honestly, in the 2.5 years, we just had our hands full just focusing on domestic policy. I think that'd be very interesting going forward.
Right here in the front, Holly, and with the black, orange, and yellow vest.
This may be way outside the realm, but I'm sort of curious, can you extrapolate ahead? I mean, if we take a look at national policy, if in fact the number of undocumented immigrants in the United States in the next 4 years was reduced by 40%, say, what would be the potential impact going forward on the kinds of findings that you came up with?
So this is going way well beyond the study. I think our current policies, beyond just possibly, you know, chilling the number of undocumented immigrants coming, I think it's actually having an effect on the total immigration population. And I do think that as a country, we're going to be worse off if we actually have fewer immigrants coming in or we have people leaving. And a lot of that comes from sort of those economic findings, but also those fiscal findings. If we actually don't have, you know, people in our labor force, the number of people that are going to have to support increasing amounts of money that has to go to something like Social Security and Medicare is going to be higher. So I think that we're actually going to be doing a disservice to the country if we have way fewer immigrants coming in when you look at sort of what's happening with the workforce and the aging of the population who are here. So I don't think it's going to be beneficial. But that is, again, my opinion. That's going well beyond what we did. But part of, you know, what was driving a lot of our fiscal results had to do with assumptions we were making about what we were going to do in terms of the budgets, especially what the federal government was going to do and at what point it would need to actually stop increased spending, increase taxes or decrease spending. And that becomes really difficult when we think about what's happening with the aging of the baby boom and some of our entitlement programs. And so how you actually do that, that's not really an immigration question, that is a fiscal question. But that will be made worse if we actually have fewer people of a working age in the country, which is what would happen if I think we limited or made it less attractive for immigrants to come.
Yes, I agree with Kim, and also would say we did not examine that question. But if, say, 40% of 11 million people, they're embedded throughout our labor force and our economy. It's just massively disruptive to producing things, to the market for consumer goods, for the housing market. It would be very disruptive.
Here in the center. Thank you.
Hi, I just have a question about how you define your terms about who's an immigrant and who's a child of an immigrant, because there are a lot of mixed status families in the United States, and a person who has one immigrant parent may also have one native-born U.S. citizen parent.
And what we did, and we had conversations about this too, and if you go in the report, you will see we have something called an independent person, which means it's basically non-children. And they're adults, and what we do is we assign half of the kids to each parent. If there are two parents in the family, if there's only one parent in the family, they get the whole child. And then we have some other estimates that are done on a household basis, because some people thought that it was really important to do it with that unit. But unlike prior studies, we did it in this way to recognize that who is listed as the householder in our surveys isn't necessary, that there are mixed households. And so by assigning parts of kids to individuals and doing it on an individual basis, we could then say that this is an immigrant and this is a second generation or a third generation, and you get parts of the kids. Which is more technical than I was going to go.
Gentleman here in the center.
Thank you. This is a tremendously valuable report, and I think the updating was a great idea, and particularly the emphasis on fiscal impact and not just economic impact. I also thought the observation that everybody is costing the government more because, and the tax cuts would increase that is a really important policy issue, slightly outside of the scope of this report. I wanted to question and encourage some future research on 3 issues. First is the allocation of educational cost to parents as opposed to the social benefits of education. I think there's a strong argument that education is a public good and that should really be allocated at least partly to what social benefits are.
And we do that.
You do.
In one of our iterations, partly, I didn't give you all of the different ways we did this, but there are some that we give half of the value of education to everybody.
Okay, that's great. Two other things, and these follow up on a couple other questions. I think it would be helpful in future studies to disaggregate the impact of unauthorized immigration and authorized immigration. And similarly, I've just written a book on citizenship and looked at the impact in part of immigration policies on American citizens. So I'm particularly interested in this issue of the racial impact of immigration, and particularly that the groups that are most affected are people less than high school and even with high school education, and what the racial impact is, the disaggregation. Because I think this has been a contentious issue, and even if it's technology, if it is in part immigration and there's a differential racial effect, I think that really needs to be teased out, and some policy to address that issue, which again is not just an immigration policy, really important for the future of the issues of equity.
And I agree. Partly, we didn't feel we had the data to do the unauthorized versus authorized, but
We did not have the data.
No.
No, period. And if data collection does not change, that study cannot be done. You cannot, at the individual level, look at authorized versus unauthorized.
and on the race thing, I think that's a valid point. The other thing that is fascinating to me as I go forward with talking about the study and what we did is thinking about all the other ways I would like to look at these questions and how I would do it differently or in addition. But it's 600 pages as it is. And so I would like to say that, and there's the sister report, which is, I think, like 300 pages.
Yeah.
which has much more, it's not about the economic impacts, but it has much more of a racial, it looks more at neighborhoods and integration and how it affects different groups. So they had more sociologists than we did. We had more economists. Their study was done a year before ours. You can decide whether that's causal or not. But I think your points are valid. I think partly at some point you need to limit what you're doing to get it done.
Just gentleman here, you had your hand up? Sylvia, I'll get you next.
Thanks very much. Very interesting panel. I'm going to refrain from defending the benefits of fundamental tax reform and calling instead for more entitlement reform. But I was interested in one of your first slides on the increase in terms of education levels of immigrants more recently. I think it was a quick slide, but towards the end, it was also true in the Midwest. Are you looking, and so that second, I think that's probably informing that second green line, or I think the second generation line, in terms of being the most beneficial fiscally, because potentially not only are they having less kids, I suppose, than the first generation immigrants, they are also achieving more in terms of revenue for the governments. Are you looking at where those did you look in the study at where those second generation folks are going in terms of, is there a brain drain of second generation immigrants similarly to the Midwest brain drain of kind of native folks who are achieving more education levels?
And we didn't do that state by state. Our state by state stuff is sort of a cross section at a point in time. It is the case in our national, so in our aggregate numbers, part of what's going on with that second generation is they are earning more and using less public services.
Can I also add another point about them that's very interesting, is they're somewhat more educated, but their education cannot fully account for their higher earnings. So they are, a group that's doing very well.
Over here.
Thank you. Two questions. Maybe you said it and I missed it, but what was the total number of immigrants? And do you have a sense of countries of what percentage or what numbers come from what countries of origin in everything that you looked at? And then the second question is, when you looked at the fiscal impact, were you able to say anything about, you talked about all labor market growth in the future coming from immigration. Are you able to say anything about the impact of immigrants in particular labor markets and fields, contributions, such as, the contributions of STEM or the contributions of low-wage immigrants making to just sustaining farm work, sustaining agriculture work?
Well, there's a lot of questions there. There is I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. There is a shift in countries of origin, and the first big shift was a movement away from Europeans and North Americans towards Latin America and Asia. And I think the Asian portion has been growing in more recent years as source. Let me just mention a methodological point that might be of interest to you. What the National Academy of Sciences generally, but not always does, is to review the literature on a field intensively and come out with findings and conclusions. That's actually what we did for the economic impact portion. We broke with the precedent in actually commissioning two fiscal analyses at the aggregate level, our own, and at the state level. So when you say, did you look at it, if the literature was there, we did look at it. And the literature was not there for a number of the questions you raised.
Over here. I'll let you pick among the three hands.
Could you perhaps speak to any gender components to your research, if found any?
Any, what was
Gender. It did not, we did not have the studies to do it in the economic impact portion. I mean, in other words, it had not been broken out in enough of the studies to reach a conclusion about that. In the fiscal part, we we didn't distinguish. It would be, I suppose, looking at female-headed versus other families. We
Right,
did
and we
not
didn't
do
really
that.
do that.
Yeah.
We did find, right, I thought that the number of women increased in the demography part. Is that in our study?
Yes, I think that women are a higher share of immigrants than they may have been in the past. Is that what you mean? Or-
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right, yeah.
And then maybe just the person right behind.
Thank you. My question is related to the sample in terms of how large was your sample and also how it was selected.
You mean for the fiscal numbers? Okay, so for the fiscal studies, we used the current population survey, which is a nationally representative sample. It isn't necessarily representative of immigrant populations by states. What we did is we took that data and we combined it with information on either national product accounts, so something that looked at sort of the balance sheet of the country, or for states, we used Census of Governments data. I think we ended up, for the state-by-state numbers, we ended up using 3 years. We used 2011, 2012, and 2013 to increase our sample size. And I think we had a weighted sample that ended up reflecting something like 100-some million households. So partly, and in the chapters, we give our sample sizes, and especially in the state-by-state chapters, we give information on how many people are in each of the generations. And partly, we did a number of tests to try and figure out whether we were comfortable in what we were saying. And, you know, I will tell you now unambiguously, I did a radio interview in Maine, and I needed to sort of warn them that those Maine numbers on immigrants weren't necessarily something I would be totally comfortable with. And so in part, as you're going down the list, if you actually look at the study and go to Chapter 9 and look at different states, the stuff towards the top, so California, Texas, and in the study, we actually spent a lot of our time talking about the top 15 states because those were samples that we felt comfortable were representative of the populations within those states, whereas the bottom 10 states, which included the Dakotas, I think either Kansas or Missouri has a surprisingly small number of immigrants, was also in that group. We were less comfortable with some of the states and some of the samples because of the sample size. Not to get too geeky with you all, but in part, we also went back and forth a lot about whether we were going to use the sample we used, which is the current population survey, versus the American Community Survey, because the ACS has bigger sample sizes. But we really did want to look at what the adult children of immigrants look like. And so there isn't a question in the ACS about where your parents are from. It's something that used to be on the census when we had the sort of long form on the decennial census that is no longer there. And that's something else that we thought was really important, that as we think about different people within this country, knowing where parents are from would be really helpful. And so having information about knowing where the parents of the current population were born would be helpful. And it was something that used to be part of what our country collected, especially reflecting sort of those last immigrant inflows in the 20th century, that we just don't have that information anymore in our national data sets.
Let me just mention that the national study did use the ACS, didn't it? At
No,
all?
use
Some of it?
CPS.
You sure? Okay.
Yeah.
I thought they did.
Okay, we'll take one more question, and then Juliana
For
will
some
wrap
of
us
it.
up.
No?
Maybe
No,
in the
because we
green.
want to do the second generation, which we can't do in ACS.
Right.
Thank you for being here today and for your research. Just a quick comment and a question. I had gathered that Canada had recognized its aging factor, and in the last year they removed their visa requirement for U.S. or for Mexican citizens to go work in Canada. Not sure what else it implied. Anyway, my question is back to the facts in policy making. How do you think that we as a society can get back to policy debates based on facts and research, and like what players can move that along institutions, grassroots organizations? Is it going to come from our representatives?
I would hope the public, right? I feel like there are a number of groups that are very interested in facts. The current rhetoric with we're redefining what is fake news versus what is not fake news is troubling to me. I feel like at some level, the public kind of needs to engage and say that they want information and they want to know where it is from. But I think it is a hard question, and I think it goes well beyond immigration to try and think about how we as a society get back to a point where people are talking with each other rather than at each other or beyond each other to go forward.
It is a terrible problem. I wish I had the answer, but I'm sorry, I have to amend what he said. We use the ACS for for the early portion,
Right.
the early portion on the demographic trends.
All right.
Well, with that, I do want to thank everyone for being here today and remind you that today's video, this live stream, is available on our website if you want to go back and even play back certain pieces, because it was really hard for capturing all this intense data. And I want to thank you in particular, our speakers, and MacArthur for providing this opportunity to bring this information to our audiences here in Chicago. And with that, we're going to adjourn our session. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.